The air in the subway car was thick with the scent of damp wool, stale coffee, and the collective, unspoken weariness of a Tuesday morning. Arthur Vance, President of the United States, stood wedged between a construction worker whose tool belt dug into his hip and a young woman rhythmically tapping on a tablet, her face illuminated by the cold blue light of stock market figures. He gripped the overhead pole, his knuckles white, the worn leather of his briefcase bumping against his leg. The train lurched, a metallic screech echoing through the tunnel, and for a moment he was just another body in the sway, another anonymous face in the river of humanity flowing into the heart of the capital. This was the core principle of the Civitas Accords, the constitutional amendment passed after the Great Unraveling. Power must never again be allowed to forget the feeling of a crowded train. It must know the frustration of a delayed bus, the price of milk, the reality of a life lived not in a gilded cage, but on the unforgiving pavement of the world it governs. Arthur's phone vibrated in his coat pocket. Not the secure, encrypted device he used for classified briefings at the Centrum, the modest glass-and-steel building that had replaced the White House, but his personal phone. The one with a spiderweb crack in the top left corner from when his daughter, Maya, had dropped it last week. He wrestled it free, his elbow nudging the construction worker, who grunted without looking up. The screen lit up with a news alert from a public source. Breaking: Serenity Dam in Sierra Nevada, reporting critical structural stress. Unconfirmed reports of fissures. Evacuations being considered for downstream towns. A cold knot tightened in Arthur's stomach. Serenity Dam. It held back the second-largest reservoir in the state, a titan of concrete and steel supplying water and power to nearly 15 million people. He had studied its schematics a year ago during a briefing on national infrastructure vulnerabilities. The report had been dry, filled with engineering jargon, but one phrase had stuck in his mind: cascade failure potential. He quickly swiped to his secure messaging app. Nothing yet. That was the other side of the Accords. Information flowed through the same congested channels as everything else. There was no dedicated satellite network to beam instant data to a bespoke command center. His intelligence chiefs were likely in the same traffic he was, trying to get to their own ordinary offices. The train shuddered to a halt between stations. A collective groan rippled through the car. The lights flickered, died, then came back on with a hum. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. He imagined the dam, a colossal wall of white, weeping, dark lines of stress. He pictured the towns nestled in the valley below: Oakhaven, Riverbend, Meadowbrook, places full of schools, diners, and homes where people were just now pouring cereal for their children, completely unaware of the immense weight hanging over their lives. He was the president. He held the highest office in the land. And in this moment, he was as powerless as every other person trapped in this metal tube underground. He couldn't pick up a red phone. He couldn't scramble a fleet of helicopters. He could only stand and wait for the train to move. The absurdity of it was a physical weight. Was this transparency? Or was it institutionalized negligence? His personal phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from his wife, Ilara. Maya forgot her history project. Again, it's on the kitchen counter. Can you possibly swing by the school on your way home? You know how Mrs. Davison gets. I'd do it, but I'm swamped at the clinic. Love you. He stared at the message, the mundane domestic crisis colliding with the impending national one. Maya's project, a diorama of the Roman Forum. He could see it in his mind's eye, a shoebox filled with lopsided clay pillars and a tiny, toga-clad figure he had helped her glue in place just last night. The figure was supposed to be Cicero, the great orator. He remembered telling Maya how Cicero spoke of the residential publica, the public thing, the commonwealth belonging to all. He had believed those words when he taught them as a history professor. He had believed them when he ran for this office. Now, as the weight of 15 million lives began to settle on his shoulders, the memory felt like a bitter irony. A notification finally appeared on his secure app. It was a single, stark line from General Marcus Thorne, chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Thorne, sir, we have a situation. Serenity Dam is failing. The train jolted forward, resuming its journey. The young woman with the tablet sighed in relief, her focus returning to the green and red arrows of commerce. The construction worker shifted his weight. No one looked at Arthur. No one knew that the man standing beside them, the man in the slightly too large trench coat, who looked like he hadn't gotten enough sleep, was now the sole focal point of a catastrophe that could reshape a state and define his presidency. He was surrounded by the very people he had sworn to protect, yet he was utterly alone, an island of terrible knowledge in a sea of blissful ignorance. The train pulled into a station, the doors hissing open. He stepped out onto the platform, swept along by the current of the crowd, just another man on his way to work. But as he walked toward the exit, a single, terrifying question echoed in the sudden silence of his own mind. How do you save a world you can't even rise above? The People's Centrum was a monument to studied modesty. It rose 20 stories from the heart of the city's commercial district, indistinguishable from the corporate law firms and tech startups that were its neighbors. There were no iron gates, no sprawling lawns, no snipers on the roof. The only indication of its significance was a simple, understated brass plaque next to the revolving doors, the Centrum, Office of the President and Executive Branch of the United States. Tourists sometimes missed it entirely. That was the point. Arthur showed his standard government ID to the security guard at the front desk, a cheerful man named Hank who always commented on the weather, and took the public elevator to the 14th floor. His security detail, two quiet figures named David and Maria, had materialized from the crowd as he exited the subway, and now stood at a respectful distance, their eyes constantly scanning, their presence a subtle but persistent reminder that his life was not entirely his own. They were the one concession the Accords made to the realities of a dangerous world, but even they were bound by rules of discretion. No motorcades, no clearing of paths. They were shadows, not shields. The presidential office, what the media had sardonically dubbed the cubicle-in-chief, was a spacious but unremarkable corner office. It had a large window with a view of a neighboring building's brick facade, a standard-issue desk, and a conference table that could seat 8. The only personal touches were a framed photo of Alaire and Maya on a windswept beach and a small, lumpy clay pot Maya had made in art class. This was the nerve center of the most powerful nation on earth. Arthur dropped his briefcase and shrugged off his coat. His chief of staff, a sharp, perpetually frazzled woman named Isabel, was already there, holding a tablet that glowed with terrifying red warnings. "It's bad, Arthur," she said, foregoing any pleasantries. The initial reports were sanitized. We're not talking about fissures anymore. We're talking about a foundational shear. The whole structure is groaning. The Army Corps of Engineers is giving it a 20% chance of complete failure in the next 48 hours. 20%? Arthur's voice was hoarse. My God, have we started evacuations? Governor Ramirez has been hesitant, Isabel replied, her fingers swiping across the screen. She's worried about causing a panic, a mass exodus that could be even more dangerous. She's calling it a managed alert phase. A managed alert phase? Arthur repeated, the bureaucratic euphemism tasting like ash in his mouth. Izzy, there are 750,000 people in the primary inundation zone. We don't have time for managed phases. We need to get them out. Now. And how do you propose we do that? She shot back, her voice tight with the same frustration he felt. You can't federalize the response without a formal request from the governor. The 10th Amendment, reinforced by the Accords. You know the rules. You can advise. You can offer resources. But you cannot command. He sank in his chair, the cheap pleather groaning in protest. This was the architecture of the New World, laid bare. The Civitas Accords had been designed as a cage, not for the people, but for power itself. They were a web of checks and balances, decentralizing authority to prevent the rise of another imperial presidency. In peacetime, it was a noble idea, a philosopher's dream of a truly representative government. But in a crisis, the web felt like a straitjacket. Every decision was a negotiation. Every action was mired in procedure. Give me Governor Ramirez on a video call, Arthur said, rubbing his temples. Give me the head of FEMA. Get me General Thorne. Patch them all in. Let's see what we can advise. The next hour was a blur of faces on a screen. Governor Ramirez, her expression a mask of political anxiety, spoke of logistical nightmares and the risk of civil unrest. The FEMA director, a capable but beleaguered man, detailed the prepositioned supplies that were stuck in commercial warehouses, waiting for official transport requests. Then there was General Thorne. His face was granite, his backdrop a flapping tent at a forward command post he'd established near the dam. "Mr. President," Thorne said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the other's prevarications. "With all due respect, advising is not going to stop a wall of water 100 feet high. My engineers are on site. They say the concrete is sweating. Sweating. We need to overrule the governor. We need to use military assets to enforce a mandatory evacuation. We need to do it yesterday." "General, you know I don't have that authority," Arthur said, the words feeling weak and inadequate. Thorne's eyes, cold and dark, seemed to look right through the screen, right through the layers of protocol and into the heart of Arthur's impotence. "The accords were written for sunny days, Mr. President. A storm is coming, and your rule book doesn't have a chapter for drowning." The call ended with no firm resolution, only a promise from the governor to reevaluate. Arthur slumped back, the weight of his office a physical pressure on his chest. He looked out the window at the brick wall. He felt like he was bricked in himself. He was the president, but the system had been designed to make him a coordinator, a facilitator, a national guidance counselor. It was a system built on the assumption that time would always be on their side. Later that afternoon, the pressure found a new crack. He took a mandatory lunch break in the Centrum's public cafeteria. As he waited in line for a sandwich, a man in a rumpled suit recognized him. "President Vance," the man said, his voice loud enough to turn a few heads. "I saw the news this morning. About that dam. What are you going to do about it? Or are you just going to form a committee while people's homes get washed away?" Arthur felt a flush of heat rise up his neck. "We are coordinating with state and local authorities to ensure everyone's safety," he recited, the line feeling hollow, even to him. The man sneered. "Coordinating, right? Back in my day, the president would have been on the ground. He would have been moving mountains, not waiting in line for tuna on rye." The man moved on, but his words lingered, laced with a poison that seeped into the cracks of Arthur's own self-doubt. The people hadn't just elected a man. They had elected an idea. But now, faced with a real, tangible threat, were they beginning to miss the very symbols of power they had once torn down? Did they secretly crave the thunder of a leader, not the quiet hum of a manager? He ate his sandwich alone at a small table, the murmur of the cafeteria around him a constant, low-grade judgment. He was living like them, eating like them, waiting in line like them. It was supposed to make him a better leader, more empathetic, more connected. But as he pictured the sweating concrete of the Serenity Dam, he couldn't shake a terrifying thought. What if this connection, this enforced humility, was just another word for being anchored to the ground when he desperately needed to fly? The quiet of Arthur's apartment was a fragile thing. It was a fifth-floor walk-up in a pre-war building, its rooms filled with the comfortable clutter of a family's life. A stack of Maya's drawings on the coffee table, Alera's running shoes by the door, the scent of garlic and olive oil still hanging in the air from last night's dinner. In theory, it was his sanctuary. In practice, it had become a second front in his unwinnable war. He arrived home long after dark. The journey back on the clattering, infrequent night trained a gauntlet of anxious thoughts. He had spent the day in a state of suspended crisis, issuing advisories that felt like pleas and watching news reports that grew more dire by the hour. He had done the job as the Accords prescribed, and he felt he had accomplished nothing. Alera was in the living room, curled on the sofa, a medical journal open but unread in her lap. The television was on, muted, showing grainy nighttime footage of the dam, illuminated by massive floodlights. Even without sound, it looked like a wounded beast. "Hey," he said softly, his voice rough with fatigue. She looked up, her eyes full of a deep, knowing exhaustion that mirrored his own. Alera was a pediatrician at a public clinic. She saw the consequences of policy every day, the children who fell through the cracks, the families struggling with the cost of living. She had been his most ardent supporter, a true believer in the Accords. But lately, he'd seen a new tension in the set of her jaw. "Hey," she replied, patting the cushion next to her. "Long day." "You could say that." He sank onto the sofa, the springs sighing. "The dam is worse than they're saying publicly. We're trying to move heaven and earth through a keyhole. Alara. The system is slow. It was designed to be slow. Arthur," she reminded him gently, her hand finding his. "Deliberate. To stop one person from having the power to make catastrophic mistakes in a heartbeat." "What if the mistake is in the deliberation itself?" he countered, looking at the silent, menacing image on the screen. "What if a heartbeat is all we have?" This was the ghost in their machine, the central, unspoken fear. He had been a professor of history. His lectures had been filled with cautionary tales of emperors and presidents who, insulated by palaces and power, had grown deaf to the cries of their people. Nero fiddling while Rome burned was not just a myth, it was a recurring theme. The Accords were supposed to be the cure, the ultimate check on the hubris of the isolated leader. Arthur had built his entire political identity on this belief. He had argued for it, campaigned on it, and now he was living it. But a darker fear had begun to creep in, a fear he barely dared to admit to himself. What if he was wrong? What if, in their righteous effort to chain the monster of tyranny, they had also crippled the hero? What if leadership, in its most crucial moments, required a degree of separation? A quiet room, a clear head, the ability to act decisively, unburdened by the need to find a seat on the morning train. "I had a dream last night," he confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "I was back at the university in my old lecture hall. It was packed. Every seat was full, and I was trying to warn them about something terrible. But I couldn't speak. Every time I opened my mouth, only dust came out. And the students, they just stared, their faces blank. They couldn't hear me." Alara squeezed his hand tighter. "It's the pressure, Art. It would break anyone. But it's not supposed to break the president," he said, the frustration boiling over into anger. "The whole point of this grand experiment is that the president is just a person. But a person can break. A person gets tired. A person has a daughter who forgets her history project." The words tumbled out, a confession of his own profound inadequacy. "I called the school today, between calls with FEMA and the Department of Transportation. I spoke to the front office. They said they'd get the diorama to Maya. And all I could think was, is this what a leader does in the middle of a national emergency? Worries about a shoebox full of clay pillars." He stood up and paced the small living room, the floorboards creaking under his weight. He felt trapped by the office, trapped by his ideals, trapped by the very apartment that was meant to keep him grounded. His greatest fear wasn't just failing the country. It was that the system he championed would be the instrument of that failure. It was the fear that history, his subject, his passion, would remember him not as a reformer, but as a fool. President Arthur Vance, the man who clung to a beautiful idea while the water rose around him. He stopped in front of Maya's bedroom door, which was slightly ajar. He could see her sleeping, her small form a lump under the covers, her breathing slow and steady. On her nightstand, illuminated by the glow of her nightlight, was the diorama. Cicero stood in the center of his lopsided forum, a symbol of the Republic, of a government of the people. The love he felt for her was a fierce, protective ache. He had taken this job, endured the scrutiny, the commute, the loss of privacy, all with the belief that he was building a better, safer, more just world for her. A world where power was accountable, where leaders were neighbors, not kings. But as he looked from his sleeping child to the silent, terrifying image of the dam on the television, the two ideas violently collided. To keep her world safe, did he have to betray the very principles he wanted her to inherit? The conflict wasn't just political anymore. It was visceral. It was the howl of a father's protective instinct against the quiet reason of a philosopher's creed. He turned back to Alara, his face a canvas of turmoil. "They look at me," he said, his voice ragged. "The people on the train, the man in the cafeteria, they look at me, and they don't see one of them. They see the president. They expect me to have the answers. They expect me to have the power. What if they're right? The question hung in the air, unanswered. It was the most dangerous question a man like him could ask. It was a crack in the foundation of his own soul, and he feared that, like the dam, it was growing wider by the minute. The decision was made in the dead of night, not with a bang, but with a reluctant, exhausted consensus. Governor Ramirez, swayed by the sheer terror in the voices of the engineers on the ground, had finally issued a mandatory evacuation order for the 3 largest towns in the inundation zone. The dam now had a less than 10% chance of surviving the next 24 hours. The storm General Thorne had predicted was no longer on the horizon. It was at the gates. Arthur's role, as defined by the Accords, was now to support and facilitate. FEMA resources were unlocked, federal agencies were directed to coordinate with state officials, and a presidential address was scheduled. Arthur felt a sliver of relief, the cold paralysis of inaction finally giving way to movement. He decided he had to go there, not for a photo opportunity, but because he couldn't bear to be another face on a screen. He had to see the ground, to speak to the people not as their distant leader, but as a fellow citizen bearing witness. This was his first trial by friction. The journey began not on the hallowed tarmac of Andrews Air Force Base, but at Reagan National Airport's commercial terminal. Arthur, Isabel, and his 2-person security detail, David and Maria, stood in the security line with everyone else. Arthur removed his shoes, his belt, his laptop from its bag, his motions mechanical. The man behind him, scrolling on his phone, sighed impatiently. "Can you believe this?" the man muttered to his companion. "An hour just to get through security, and a 3-hour flight delay. We'll be lucky to get to Sacramento by nightfall." Arthur said nothing. His own flight, a standard commercial booking, was also delayed. Technical difficulties. He, the President of the United States, was grounded by a faulty hydraulic sensor on a Boeing 737, while a clock was ticking down on the lives of thousands. The irony was a physical sickness. He could feel General Thorne's imagined disapproval like a burn on the back of his neck. "I could have had you airborne in a military transport in 15 minutes, Mr. President. But by all means, enjoy the complimentary beverage service." When they finally boarded, they were in Economy Plus. A small mercy. Arthur took the window seat. As the plane taxied and finally lifted into the sky, he pressed his forehead against the cool plastic of the window, watching the Capitol shrink below. For the first time, he felt a pang of longing for the very thing he had decried, the majestic, soaring bubble of Air Force One. It wasn't the luxury he missed. It was the altitude, the ability to rise above the fray, to see the whole board, to move with purpose and speed. Down here, in the trenches of ordinary life, the view was limited, and everything moved so agonizingly slow. They landed in Sacramento 6 hours later than planned. The next challenge, a rental car. Isabel had pre-booked a full-size sedan. They waited for 20 minutes at the rental counter behind a family arguing about car seats. When it was their turn, the agent, a young man with a name tag that read Kevin, smiled blankly. "Vance, party of 4? Okay, I have your reservation, but it looks like we're out of full-size sedans. I can give you a compact, or there's a minivan, but it smells a little like old fries." Isabel looked like she was about to have an aneurysm. "A minivan? We are on official government business. This is unacceptable." Kevin shrugged, unimpressed. "Take it or leave it, lady. The evacuations have started. Everyone's trying to get a car." They took the minivan. Arthur insisted on driving. As he merged onto the highway, heading east toward the Sierra Nevada foothills, the friction of reality became a grinding, soul-crushing force. The highway was a parking lot. A river of red taillights stretched to the horizon, a chaotic, panicked exodus of the very people he was trying to help. They were boxed in, a single car in a tide of fear. His phone rang. It was the secure line, patched through the van's Bluetooth. General Thorne's voice filled the small space, crisp and damning. "Mr. President, where are you?" "We're on Highway 50, General. We're making our way." A pause. Thorne didn't need to say anything. His silence was condemnation enough. Sir, the outward-facing turbines have shut down. The internal pressure is building exponentially. The ground crews are pulling back. It's going to go. It's a matter of hours, maybe less. The local emergency services are overwhelmed. The roads are jammed. People are abandoning their cars. This is turning into a full-blown humanitarian disaster, and we are still in a support role. Suddenly, a call came through on the public traffic app on Arthur's personal phone. A voice, frantic and distorted by a bad connection, broke through. "This is Mayor Thompson of Oakhaven. Is anyone there? Can anyone hear me? We're cut off. The bridge on the north side of town is gridlocked, and a mudslide has taken out the county road to the east. We have 2,000 people trapped in the town center. We need air support. We need someone to get these people out." Arthur's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Oakhaven. It was one of the towns closest to the dam. He looked at the GPS. They were still 50 miles away, trapped in the same gridlock as everyone else. He was the commander-in-chief, and he was stuck in a minivan that smelled of old fries, listening to a mayor plead for help he couldn't provide. "Mayor Thompson," Arthur said, his voice strained. "This is President Vance." There was a choked sob on the other end of the line. "Mr. President? Oh, thank God. Sir, you have to help us. The water, when it comes, will be the first to go. My people are going to drown." Arthur looked at Isabel. Her face was pale, her professional composure shattered, replaced by naked horror. He looked at David and Maria in the back seat, their expressions grim, their hands resting near their concealed firearms, useless against a wall of water. He was the president, and he was just another man stuck in traffic. The system wasn't just slow. It was a cage built for a world without monsters. But a monster was coming, a monster of concrete and water, and his hands were tied with the red tape of his own idealism. "Stay on the line, Mayor," Arthur said, his own voice sounding distant and hollow. We're working on it." But as he said the words, he knew they were a lie. He wasn't working on it. He was sitting in it. The full, crushing weight of his powerlessness descended upon him. Was this leadership? To offer false hope from a traffic jam? The minivan became their prison. For 2 more hours, they crawled forward at a pace that was more psychological torture than travel. The sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and apocalyptic red, the colors reflecting off the endless roofs of stranded cars. The air was thick with the smell of exhaust fumes and rising panic. On the radio, news anchors spoke in somber tones, their voices a Greek chorus narrating the impending tragedy. Mayor Thompson's calls had become more sporadic, his voice hoarser with each attempt, until finally, they stopped altogether. The silence was more terrifying than his pleas. Arthur felt something inside him begin to fracture. The calm, professorial demeanor he had cultivated his whole life was cracking under a pressure he had never imagined. He wasn't a philosopher debating hypotheticals anymore. He was a man watching a city die in slow motion from the front seat of a rented vehicle. Just as darkness fell, an alert pinged on Isabel's tablet. A section of the highway ahead had been cleared for emergency vehicles. But they weren't one. The state troopers waving traffic through were letting ambulances and fire trucks pass, but their minivan, with its civilian plates, was directed to a side road. They were diverted into the town of Pine Creek, a place that was rapidly becoming a makeshift refugee camp. The local high school gymnasium had been turned into a shelter. It was there, under the buzzing fluorescent lights of the gym, surrounded by the displaced and the terrified, that General Thorne found him. There was no formal announcement. One moment Arthur was helping an elderly woman find a blanket. The next Thorne was standing beside him, his uniform immaculate, his presence an island of rigid authority in the sea of chaos. He must have landed by helicopter nearby. "Mr. President," Thorne said, his voice a low, private thunder. A word. He led Arthur away from the throng, past the cots and the crying children, to a quiet, empty classroom. The air smelled of chalk dust and floor wax. On the blackboard, a teacher had left a half-erased sentence. "History teaches us that." Thorne closed the door, shutting out the noise of the gym. For a moment, the two men just stood there in the dim light, the embodiment of two opposing philosophies. You wanted to be on the ground, sir, Thorne began, his voice devoid of its usual sarcasm, replaced by something colder, graver. Well, here you are. How does it feel? It feels useless, General, Arthur admitted, the word tasting like defeat. It is, Thorne stated, not as an insult, but as a fact. This experiment in manufactured humility, the Civitas Accords, it's a noble sentiment, but it is predicated on a fatal assumption, that all problems can be solved with empathy and consensus. Some problems, Mr. President, require raw, unencumbered power. A flood doesn't care about your connection to the common man. It only respects a wall of sandbags higher than itself, put there by a force that can move faster than the water. Arthur said nothing, his gaze fixed on the half-erased sentence on the blackboard. History teaches us that what? That power corrupts? Or that powerlessness kills? The founders of the Accords weren't as naive as their public writings suggest, Thorne continued, his voice dropping even lower. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a slim, sealed black folder. It had no markings. They were idealists, but they weren't fools. They understood that a true existential threat might one day emerge, a crisis so vast and so immediate that their carefully constructed web of checks and balances would become a suicide pact. He placed the folder on a student's desk. The plastic made a soft, definitive sound in the quiet room. They built a failsafe, Thorne said. A ghost in the machine. It's called the Chimera Protocol. It has never been activated. Its existence is known only to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and a handful of others. It is the ultimate emergency power. Arthur stared at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. What does it do? It does what you need it to do, Thorne answered, his eyes boring into Arthur. Upon your signature and my counter-signature, it temporarily suspends key provisions of the Civitas Accords for a period of 72 hours. It grants you, as Commander-in-Chief, supreme authority over state and local governments in the designated disaster zone. It gives you command of the National Guard, unimpeded access to military transport, the power to seize property, and the authority to enforce any order deemed necessary for the preservation of life. No more asking Governor Ramirez. No more waiting in traffic. No more rental minivans. The air in the room grew thick, heavy with the weight of temptation. It was everything he lacked. It was the sword to cut through the Gordian knot of his own making. It was the power he had spent his entire career arguing against, now offered to him as a salvation. For 72 hours, Thorne clarified, you would cease to be President Vance, the citizen. You would become the president, the one from the history books, the one who can move mountains. Arthur walked over to the desk and stared down at the black folder. It was a Pandora's box. Inside was the power to save thousands, to silence the voice of Mayor Thompson in his head, to finally act. But what would be the cost? To activate it would be to admit that his entire philosophy was a lie, a luxury for peacetime that had no place in the real world. It would be a betrayal of every voter who had believed in his vision of a new kind of leadership. It would prove his critics and men like Thorne right. But the alternative was to remain here, in this classroom, a helpless spectator to a massacre, clinging to his principles while Oakhaven drowned. History teaches us, Thorne said, echoing the words on the blackboard, that leaders are defined not by the power they are given, but by the power they are willing to take when it matters most. He looked from the folder to Thorne's unyielding face. The general wasn't just offering a solution. He was offering a choice, a test. It was a revelation not just about a hidden rule of his world, but about the very nature of the power he supposedly held. The system he thought he knew was a facade, and behind it lay a terrible, seductive secret. The power is yours for the taking, Mr. President, Thorne said, his voice a quiet, chilling whisper. The question is, are you strong enough to use it? The black folder sat on the flimsy desk in the corner of the classroom, an object of immense gravity. Arthur felt its pull, a dark star consuming all the light in the room. He didn't touch it. He didn't need to. He could feel the power radiating from it, a warmth that promised action, decisiveness, and an end to the agonizing helplessness that had been gnawing at him for 2 days. "Why are you showing me this now, General?" Arthur asked, his voice steady despite the tremor in his soul. "Because I took an oath to protect this country, Mr. President," Thorne replied, his tone unyielding. "Not to a philosophy, not to an amendment, but to the nation and its people. And right now, the greatest threat to those people is our inaction. I am giving you the tool to act. Whether you use it is a test of your leadership." With that, Thorne gave a curt nod, turned, and left the room, leaving Arthur alone with the ghost in the machine. He stayed in that classroom for what felt like an eternity, the muted sounds of the shelter outside, a distant, sorrowful hum. He was no longer just a man in a crisis. He was the fulcrum of a philosophical war. To sign the protocol was to become the very thing he had run against. A leader who believed the ends justified the means. A man who would sacrifice principle for pragmatism. To refuse was to uphold his ideals. But at what cost? How many lives was a principle worth? He finally picked up the folder and returned to the chaos of the gymnasium. He found Isabel organizing a water distribution line, her face smudged with dirt, her usual sharp business attire replaced by a borrowed high school sweatshirt. He pulled her aside. "Izzy, I need you," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I need your thoughts." Unfiltered, he led her to a quiet corner and explained the Chimera protocol. He watched her face as he spoke, saw the flicker of shock, then disbelief, then a slow, dawning comprehension. She, like him, was a product of the new system, a believer. "My God, Arthur," she breathed, staring at the folder in his hand. "A constitutional override hidden in plain sight. It's a coup in waiting." "It's also a lifeboat," he countered, the words tasting strange in his mouth. "Think what we could do. We could have helicopters airlifting people out of Oakhaven within the hour. We could have the Army Corps building emergency levees around Meadowbrook by dawn. We could save them, Izzy." Isabel looked away from him, out at the faces in the gymnasium, the exhausted parents, the crying children, the elderly staring blankly into space. "And what happens in 72 hours?" she asked, her voice sharp. "What happens when the flood recedes, and everyone remembers that the president tore up the rulebook? The precedent it would set. Arthur, you'd be validating every argument the authoritarians ever made. You'd prove that our way, the people's way, is just a fairy tale for quiet times." Her words were a mirror of his own deepest fears. But then his phone vibrated. A news alert. Breaking. Seismic tremors detected around Serenity Dam. Geologists warn of imminent, catastrophic failure. Complete collapse, now considered inevitable. A new wave of panic rippled through the gym as people saw the alert on their own phones. A woman near them began to sob uncontrollably. The crisis had found a new gear. The 24-hour clock had just become a countdown to minutes. It was in that moment of escalating chaos that the true crisis, the personal one, struck him. His personal phone rang. It was Alara. He stepped outside into the cold night air to answer it. "Arthur, are you okay? I saw the news, the tremors." Her voice was thin, stretched taut with fear. "I'm fine, Alara. I'm at a shelter in Pine Creek. We're safe. But the dam—" "I know," she cut in. "I know. Arthur, I saw you on the news earlier, stuck in that traffic jam. They're tearing you apart. They're calling you weak, ineffective. There are protesters outside the Centrum." He heard a tremor in her voice that wasn't from a distant geological fault. "And today, some people recognized Maya and me at the grocery store. They yelled at us. They said you were letting people die. One of them threw a carton of eggs at our feet. Maya was so scared. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. It was one thing to face the abstract judgment of pundits and the anger of strangers. It was another entirely to imagine it splashing at the feet of his child. To know that his commitment to an ideal was now placing his own family in the path of public rage. "Alara," he started, but he had no words. "Arthur, listen to me," she said, her voice dropping to a desperate, conspiratorial whisper. "This isn't working. This beautiful, noble idea, it's failing. The people don't want a neighbor right now, Art. They want a savior. They want a leader who can command the storm, not just get rained on with the rest of us. They need the president. There was a pause, and what she said next was the ultimate betrayal. Not of him, but of the dream they had shared. Maybe Thorne is right. Maybe this isn't the time for philosophy. Just get those people out. Whatever it takes. He felt the ground give way beneath him. Alara, his moral compass, his partner in the belief that a better way was possible. Even she was telling him to abandon it. Her love for him, her fear for their family, had become a powerful argument for the very thing they had both despised. It wasn't a political betrayal. It was a betrayal born of love, which made it all the more devastating. He was now truly alone in his conviction. He ended the call, his hand trembling. The cries from the gym, the memory of Maya's frightened face, the desperate pleas of Mayor Thompson, and now, the capitulation of his own wife. It all swirled into a single, deafening roar in his head. He walked back into the empty classroom, the black folder on the desk seeming to pulse in the gloom. He was no longer weighing a political decision. He was a husband who wanted to protect his family, a father who wanted to end his daughter's fear, a man who was being offered a chance to stop the screaming. He sat down, opened the folder, and pulled out a single, stark document. It was the activation order for Protocol Chimera. A space for his signature was at the bottom. The pen felt impossibly heavy in his hand. He thought of Cicero, the defender of the Republic, who was ultimately murdered on the orders of a triumvirate that had seized absolute power to restore order. His ideals were a distant, fading light. The darkness of immediate, tangible reality was closing in. He stared at the signature line, the fate of a nation and the integrity of his own soul balanced on the tip of his pen. This was the turning point. This was where the philosopher died and the king was born. Or was it where the man, broken by love and fear, finally surrendered? The pen hovered over the paper, a millimeter of space separating two versions of himself, two futures for his country. The air in the classroom was thick with the ghosts of his own lectures. Warnings about Caesar crossing the Rubicon, about the allure of the emergency decree, about the slow, seductive path from republic to empire. And in his ear, he heard the echo of Alara's voice, a loving whisper urging him toward damnation, whatever it takes. He lowered the pen until its tip touched the document. He could feel the ink waiting to flow, to seal the pact. He saw it all in a flash. The thunder of military helicopters descending on Oakhaven, the disciplined lines of soldiers building fortifications, the grateful faces of the rescued. He saw the approval ratings soar. He saw the fear vanish from Maya's eyes. He saw himself on television, no longer the helpless observer, but the decisive commander, the man who had met the storm and turned it back. It was a potent, intoxicating vision. And then he saw the aftermath. He saw the next crisis, years from now, and a future president, less scrupulous than himself, pointing to the advanced precedent as justification for seizing power. He saw the Civitas Accords, not as a living document, but as a quaint, failed experiment displayed in a museum. He saw the cage they had so carefully built for power lying in ruins, its bars bent and broken. He saw the ghost in the machine, now unleashed, haunting the halls of government forever. His hand trembled. He was a historian. He knew that the doors to authoritarianism were always opened with the key of necessity. He pulled the pen back. With a surge of sudden, startling clarity, he stood up, leaving the unsigned protocol on the desk. He walked out of the classroom, through the despair of the gymnasium, and found Isabel. "Give me a location," he said, his voice imbued with a new, quiet authority that had nothing to do with military command. "I need to address the nation. Not from studio. From here. From the ground. And give me a list of every local fire chief, every town supervisor, every community organizer you can find in a 50-mile radius. I need them on a conference line in 10 minutes. Isabel stared at him, her eyes wide with uncertainty. "Arthur, what are you doing?" "The dam. I made my choice, Izzy," he said. "We're not going over the wall. We're going through it. The hard way. The slow way. Our way." An hour later, Arthur Vance stood at a makeshift podium in the dusty parking lot of Pine Creek High School. The podium was a stack of lunch tables. The lighting was from the high beams of 2 state trooper cars. The camera was from a local news crew that had been stranded with them. Behind him, the gymnasium full of evacuees formed a silent, watching congregation. This was not the Oval Office. This was not a grand address to a joint session of Congress. This was a man in a rumpled suit, speaking to his country from the heart of its own fear. He began to speak, his voice carried across the nation by a patchwork of networks. "My fellow citizens," he started, his voice not booming, but calm, intimate. "For the last 48 hours, you have watched, as I have, in horror and in helplessness. You have been told that a great storm is coming to break a part of our nation. And you have looked to me, to your government, for a response. And you have seen what you believe is weakness. You have seen delay. You have seen your president stuck in traffic." He paused, letting the raw truth of the admission settle. "You are not wrong. Our system, the one we chose together after the unraveling, is slow. It is cumbersome. It is designed to be. It was designed to force us to talk to each other, to rely on each other, to prevent any one person from holding the power of a thunderbolt in their hands. We did this because we remember, as I remember, what happens when power is easy." He looked directly into the camera, his gaze unflinching. He was no longer a man torn by conflict. He was a man defending his last trench. "Tonight, I was offered a thunderbolt, a secret key to unlock the old ways, the power to command, to overrule, to act with the terrible speed and force of a dictator, all in the name of safety. I was told it was my duty to take it, to be the strong man you secretly crave." He let the silence hang for a beat, thick and heavy. "I am refusing that power." A murmur went through the small crowd behind him. On the airwaves, a nation held its breath. "I am refusing it because our greatest strength is not in the power of a single leader, but in the collective power of 100 million of us. The speed we need will not come from a general's command, but from a neighbor helping a neighbor. The force we need will not come from a presidential decree, but from a million hands that will rise to this challenge. Therefore, I am not issuing commands. I'm making a plea. I'm decentralizing this response. To every citizen near the disaster zone, you are now the front line. To every local official, you have the full, unmitigated support of the federal government to act as you see fit. Your ingenuity is our policy. Your courage is our strategy. We will get you the resources you need, but the decisions will be yours. Turn your schools into shelters. Turn your businesses into command posts. The plans you make in your own town halls will be the ones that save you. This is a test, not of me, but of us, of the very idea this nation is now built upon. Is a government of the people, by the people, strong enough to survive a storm? I believe it is. I am betting my presidency and all of our futures on that belief. I am betting on you." He finished speaking. The only sound was the wind, whipping dust around the parking lot. There was no applause, only a stunned, profound silence. He had not offered them a savior. He had offered them a mirror. He had placed the burden of salvation squarely on their own shoulders. He stepped away from the podium, his heart hammering. He had made his choice. He had renounced the seductive promise of the chimera and embraced the chaotic, uncertain, beautiful mess of democracy. He had chosen the slow, hard path. Now, as the first confirmed reports of water overtopping the dam began to chatter on the emergency radios, the only question that remained was a terrible one. In choosing to save his nation's soul, had he just condemned thousands of its people to die? The hours that followed were a blur of organized chaos. Arthur, Isabel, and a small, hastily assembled team worked from the high school's library, transforming it into a national coordination center. It was unlike any command post in history. There were no generals moving fleets on a digital map. Instead, there were librarians and tech-savvy students routing internet phone calls, connecting a cattle rancher with a helicopter to a stranded community, patching a construction foreman with heavy machinery through to a town that needed a defensive berm. It was messy. It was inefficient. Tragic failures happened in real time. The town of Oakhaven, where Mayor Thompson had pleaded for help, was lost. The dam breached on its eastern flank just before dawn, and a wave of water, merciless and swift, scoured the valley floor. The news came via a crackling ham radio report, a final, garbled testament to a town that was now gone. The weight of those 2,000 lives fell on Arthur like a physical blow. He retreated to a corner of the library, the sounds of his makeshift operations center fading to a dull roar, and wept. This was the price, the immediate, countable, unbearable price of his choice. But then, strange, miraculous stories began to trickle in. In the town of Meadowbrook, a local hardware store owner had used social media to organize a volunteer brigade. They had emptied her store of every sandbag, every sheet of plywood, and built a mile-long, makeshift levee that diverted the worst of the floodwaters around the town's historic center. In another valley, a group of whitewater rafting guides used their knowledge of the river and their own rafts to rescue hundreds of people from rooftops. The decentralized response was not a clean, military operation. It was a messy, human, and unexpectedly resilient tapestry of courage. More lives were lost than might have been under the swift, authoritarian fist of the Chimera Protocol. The post-disaster analysis would make that brutally clear. But something else was saved. As the waters receded, they left behind not just devastation, but a network of communities that had discovered their own strength. They had not been saved by a distant, powerful father figure. They had saved themselves. Arthur served out the rest of his term. He was a polarizing figure, a paradox. To some, he was President Vance, the man who had let Oak Haven drown, a weak idealist whose philosophical stubbornness had cost thousands of lives. They burned him in effigy. To others, he was a visionary, the man who had faced the ultimate test and refused to sacrifice the nation's soul for a tyrant's efficiency. They called him the second founder. He never won a second term. He didn't even try. 5 years later, the man walking across the university campus was no longer President Vance. He was just Professor Vance. His hair was grayer, and the lines around his eyes were etched deeper, permanent reminders of the weight he had carried. He walked with Alara, their hands intertwined, a quiet, comfortable rhythm to their steps. Maya was away at college, studying engineering of all things. She wanted to build better dams. They stopped at a newly dedicated monument near the campus library. It was a simple wall of polished black granite, etched with the names of every person who had died in the Serenity Dam disaster. 2,947 names. Arthur ran his fingers over the cool, carved letters of Thompson. "Do you ever wonder?" Alara asked softly, her gaze on the wall. "Every day," he replied, his voice a low murmur. "I see their faces when I close my eyes. I hear their voices." "You did the right thing, Arthur," she said, a quiet conviction in her tone that had been absent 5 years ago in that desperate phone call. "You held the line." "Did I?" He mused, his gaze distant. "Or did I just trade a quick death for a slow one? The country is more divided than ever on what leadership means." Just then, a young woman with a backpack full of books approached him hesitantly. "Professor Vance? I'm sorry to bother you. I'm in your History of Power seminar." "It's no bother, Anna," he said, offering a tired smile. We were studying your presidency," she said, her eyes flicking to the monument and back to him. "I just have to ask, if you could go back to that night, in that school, with the power to save everyone, would you do it again? Was it worth it?" It was the question, the one he asked himself in the dark of night, the one history would debate for centuries. Arthur looked from his student's earnest, searching face to the long list of names carved in stone. He thought of the two kinds of cost. The first was written here, in granite, sharp, finite, and agonizing. The second cost was invisible, the cost of a precedent, the price of a surrendered freedom, the slow, corrosive decay of a republic's ideals. One cost was a wound, the other a poison. "Worth it?" he repeated, the words tasting of ash and memory. "There is no worth it when a life is lost. There's only the choice you make, and the world that choice creates. I chose a world that is harder, messier, and sometimes more tragic. But it's also a world where we are still forced to look each other in the eye. A world where power still has to wait in line. I chose our world, Anna, with all its flaws, with all its friction." He didn't answer her question directly. He couldn't. He had made a choice not between a good outcome and a bad one. but between two different kinds of tragedy. He turned back to the wall, his hand finding Ilara's again. He was no longer the president. He was just a man, an ordinary citizen who had once been asked to be a king and had said no. He had held the line, but the line was a scar that ran through the heart of his nation and through his own. The resolution was not a victory, but a quiet, profound, and unending ache. He had saved the idea of his country, but he would carry the ghosts of its cost forever. And in that, perhaps, was the final, unspoken lesson of the Civitas Accords. True leadership was not about the absence of pain, but about the willingness to bear its weight for the sake of a principle.